You're listening to another podcast. A podcast not only of reviewing and discussing, but of discovery. A deep dive into a classic show whose influence is immeasurable. Your next stop? Anthology. Hello and welcome to Anthology, presented by ObsessiveViewer.com. I'm your host, Matt Hurt, and if this is your first time listening, Anthology is a podcast where I review The Twilight Zone as a first-time viewer and other classic and contemporary science fiction anthology series. For archives of all of my episodes, visit AnthologyPod.com. You can also like the Facebook page at Facebook.com/AnthologyPod and follow me on Twitter at OVAnthologyPod. And if you'd like to support what I do here, you can become a patron at Patreon.com/ObsessiveViewer, where at the $1 or $2 per month level, you get access to a backlog of tons of exclusive pre-show episodes recorded exclusively for Patreon supporters, spread across all three of my podcasts. And additionally, at the $5 a month level, you get that, plus exclusive commentary tracks and movie reaction videos. And finally, at $10 per month, you get all that plus early access to episodes and unreleased content from all of my shows. Again, that's at patreon.com/obsessiveviewer. So, welcome to Anthology again. Today, I'm going to be discussing The Passersby. It's the fourth episode of The Twilight Zone's third season, and it originally aired on October 6th, 1961, and I'll be rounding out the episode with a brief review of Science Fiction Theater Season 1, Episode 14, The Strange Doctor Lorenz. So, before I get into that, just some housekeeping and everything to go over. Last week's episode, The Shelter, was recorded March 13th, and I'm recording this in advance, so this is March 14th, and I just want to say that I hope you guys don't mind me working through some of the audio stuff that I'm doing with the new equipment and everything. I noticed that there were some different levels with the recording on that, so hopefully that wasn't too bad or anything. I believe that I fixed that issue with this one, so yeah, I hope you guys don't mind me working through that. So, as I normally do throughout all of these episodes, I'm going to be spoiling the entirety of The Passersby. So, before I get into my review, I want to kind of warn you guys, I'm going to be spoiling The Passersby. And yeah, so let's just dive right in. I'm going to read the plot summary, courtesy of The Twilight Zone, Unlocking the Door to a Television Classic by Martin Grams Jr., and here we go. Lavinia relaxes on the front porch of the remnants of what was once her house, partially scorched as a casualty of the American Civil War. A passerby known as the Sergeant stops to rest a spell, striking up a friendly conversation. Day after day, she has been watching as the tired and wounded march past her residence, reminding her of the grim repercussions of the bloody war. Among the wounded is a young boy rumored to have been shot in the head and killed at Gettysburg. The man responsible for the death of her husband gives Lavinia ample opportunity to seek vengeance, but the killer passes by when she apparently misses him with a direct gunshot to the face. Eventually, the sergeant figures out why the wounded have been slowly marching down the road. They, too, are the war's dead. Thanking her for the hospitality, the sergeant departs. Lavinia, having succumbed from a fever weeks before, will not accept the inevitable. Even her husband makes an appearance, and like the rest of the Walking Dead, he is driven by instinct to see what is down at the end of the road, leaving her behind. It takes the wisdom of Abraham Lincoln, the last casualty of the war, to convince her that she, too, should join those walking down the scorched road. The Passersby stars James Gregory as the Confederate sergeant, who doesn't have a name in the episode. This is his second of two Twilight Zone episodes, and this was pretty cool. His first appearance on the Twilight Zone was actually in the series premiere, Where Is Everybody? Way back in season 1, of course. He was one of the army generals at the end of the episode, so that's pretty neat. And other than that, he appeared in several Serling properties or Serling things. So there was an episode of Danger from 1954 called Knife in the Dark that he appeared in with the teleplay by Serling. And the episode of Playhouse 90, A Town Has Turned to Dust from 1958, he appeared in that as well. And that's an episode that I reviewed in episode 45 of this podcast. And he also appeared in an episode of The Loner titled A Question of Guilt in 1966. And rounding out his Serling collaborations, James Gregory appeared in an episode of Night Gallery in the segment Stop Killing Me in 1972. Outside of collaborations with Serling, he appeared in one episode of Star Trek, and he was in the Planet of the Apes sequel, Beneath the Planet of the Apes, in 1970. And co-starring as Lavinia is Joanne Linville. This was her only episode of The Twilight Zone. However, she did appear in one episode of Star Trek, and she was in 2 episodes of One Step Beyond for the sci-fi anthology kind of, I wouldn't say trifecta because it's just 2 shows. But anyway, so appearing as Judd in this episode is Warren J. Kemmerling. This was his only appearance on The Twilight Zone. And as far as collaborations with Serling, he appeared uncredited in 1962's Incident in an Alley, which was based on a short story by Serling. And he also appeared in one episode of One Step Beyond, and he was also in Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind in 1977, so that's pretty cool. And rounding out the cast as Abraham Lincoln is Austin Green. This was his only episode of The Twilight Zone. In addition to many roles in his career, he also played Lincoln in an episode of Medic, and in 1957's The Story of Mankind. So that's the cast, and writer for this episode was Rod Serling. And this is an interesting piece of trivia about this episode and about Serling writing it. So he had previously written a script called The Cause, which was about a Union soldier who was named Judd, returning from the Civil War and kind of shacking up with a Southern woman. They end up falling in love, and when her father returns, she has to choose between staying with Judd and staying with her family, I guess. It aired on Matinee Theater on May 12th, 1958, and I was so excited when I heard that because I was like, oh, I can do this as a bonus review instead of science fiction theater, but I can't find it anywhere, so I just have to assume that it's just been lost to time. Matinee Theater, I think, was a daily anthology show, like live production anthology show, so it's not, it's not a surprise that the recordings of that or what have you don't exist anymore if it's a daily anthology show. And rounding out the cast and crew is director Elliot Silverstein. This was his second of 4 total Twilight Zone episodes. His previous episode was one of my personal favorites, The Obsolete Man. And next we'll see from him is toward the end of this season of the show. He directed The Trade-Ins, Season 3, Episode 31. And outside of The Twilight Zone, he also directed 4 episodes of Tales from the Crypt. So kind of keeping that in the anthology genre, anthology family, I guess. So now with the talent rundown out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and talk about my feelings as a viewer for The Passersby. And before I do that, obviously, what I usually do, what I knew before going into this episode, I did not have a clue. So this is one of those episodes of The Twilight Zone that didn't permeate pop culture references in my viewpoint or in my sphere of pop culture references over the years. So I had no clue what to expect from this episode. My kind of little blurb that I wrote as an estimation for it was maybe it's about some strangers someone encounters each day having a bigger impact on their life than they think. I was thinking in more along the lines of maybe like a secret group pulling the strings like in the Adjustment Bureau. Obviously, was completely off base. That was completely inaccurate, but I don't mind. So, that's what I knew and what I thought of beforehand. So, let me go into my actual review of The Passersby. So, this episode opens up very clearly showing us that this is set in the Civil War era, and we immediately get Serling's opening narration, which I'm not going to play yet because it's a split opening narration, so I'm going to play it when he appears on screen in this review, so hold tight for the opening narration. But it's introduced as like, this is the end of the Civil War. We're walking down the road with all of these exhausted soldiers, and I thought that this opening scene, just the opening visual, was incredibly evocative. It's an incredibly effective imagery in this opening scene. Like there's this overhead view at an angle at the road that all of these just visibly exhausted soldiers are walking down. And the viewpoint is kind of through the brush of the trees, and the camera moves and the view is obscured by a tree, not trunk, not branch, but tree middle part. And it's interesting. That coupled with the light fog effect, with the very detailed walk effect, or like the kind of just the detail in the performance of the people on screen that are walking, because they are just shambling. It's very clear that they are extremely exhausted. And I just thought that was just a very effective hook and everything. Now, I will say that I felt overall, and I'll get into that later, obviously, overall, I felt this episode it's not my favorite episode. It's not a particularly strong episode in the vein of Maple Street, Obsolete Man, or The Shelter, for that matter. I would say, no pun intended, this is kind of a middle-of-the-road episode for me, but for reasons that I'll explain later in this review, it does get elevated to a bit at certain points. So as we watch these men walk through the foggy, just ominous road, we see the sergeant. He's a man with a crutch, and he is kind of just limping toward this. The best way I can describe it is a driveway, but I don't think it's a driveway. The lawn of a house, and we see a woman just kind of sitting on the porch, and he asks her if he can have some of the water that is like right nearby. And I really like the set design of this. Like there's a lot of like trees and overgrowth. It almost feels like a swampy atmosphere. And the framing of this shot where he's asking her about getting the water is really good too. Like he is in the foreground of the shot, and she is kind of at a distance on the porch in the background. And the kind of perspective of it is cool, because he's occupying half, if not most, of the screen, and you just kind of see her at a distance. It's just really beautiful framing and everything. So we see that he has a guitar, and he comments on the tree being beautiful. He says the tree was beautiful once, and she's very distant, and she's very what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. She's very distant and not really that talkative or receptive to him talking. And at that point, I kind of wondered if they were on opposite sides, but that's not the case. But again, the set design of this, the production value is just really, really incredible, because the wreckage of the house is something that I didn't notice the first time around, or the first couple of times watching this episode. But when you watch it and when you look at it, and you look at it more detail, like the house is kind of in shambles. It's in ruins. There's boards up against the wall, boarding up a window and everything. And you see like this not ravine, but like this valley, I guess would be the word I would use to describe it, but of debris that's kind of littering the lawn. And I thought that was just really good set design, and a really good way to evoke just the shambles of not only this location and the mental state of the passersby or anything, but you can kind of extrapolate that to be about the country as a whole in the aftermath of the Civil War. And so after he's gotten his water, the sergeant asks if he can kind of just sit there and rest for a bit. And he starts strumming his guitar, and this kind of livens her up a little bit. She says that her husband used to play the guitar, and when he asks where he is, she says he died in the war. And here it's interesting. She references that he died at Yellow Tavern with General Stuart. And I'll admit, I don't know much about the Civil War, but I did read trivia saying that that's a real battle, the Battle of Yellow Tavern. This is what I found that I'll just read real quick from the IMDb trivia page for this episode. The Battle of Yellow Tavern took place in May 1864 near Richmond, Virginia. Union cavalry under Major General Phil Sheridan outnumbered and outgunned Confederate cavalry led by Major General J.E.B. Stuart, who was mortally wounded and died the next day. So that's the reference there. And I just want to say, just really quick, there is a 3-volume narrative of the Civil War written by Shelby Foote that I've been wanting to read for several years, but I never got around to it and haven't gotten around to it yet. But just that's something that you might want to check out if this subject interests you, because I've heard really great things. Apparently, it goes like beat for beat the entire Civil War over 3 volumes, and it's written like a narrative. So I'll eventually check that out. I'm sure, probably, we'll see. So back to the episode. So after talking about her husband dying, she kind of becomes she has this kind of wistful thing where she talks about how painful the war has been for her. She talks about how when it started, there were trumpets and drums, and everyone was excited that and talking about how they'll beat the Yanks in a month, and how it didn't work out that way, essentially. And this is just, on one hand, I wonder if that's what the idea of it was, like if that's how it really was back then at the start of the Civil War. But this by itself is just a really strong depiction of the pain and trauma of the Civil War in this scenario. It's both in the performance of Joanne Linville and in the imagery of the passersby, both in terms of their shambling and in the set design and everything. But this entire episode is about this. I don't want to say it's about the grief of a nation, but it is about the pain of going through a traumatic civil war, and how there's no real I don't know. I'm stumbling here, but it feels like it's in the aftermath of the Civil War, how draining and heartbreaking that ordeal was for the entire country. So I just thought that was really well illustrated in this episode. So at this point, Lavinia gets up and she starts to stumble. And this is our first hint at what's to come in the episode. She gets up, starts to stumble. She references that she has a fever, but she's on the mend now. But she's pretty weak. And at this point, I've just got to say, again, I don't know. I was embarrassed to say that I didn't know what side he was on, the sergeant. I didn't know if he was like a Union soldier or a Confederate soldier. He's a Confederate soldier. And I thought maybe I was just wondering if he was a Union soldier and that was going to be like a thing where she is there and maybe he's the one that killed her husband or something, but it doesn't go to that level. He's a Confederate soldier. So I don't know. And I also had a theory that I thought that maybe it would be that he's remorseful over a soldier that he killed, and that this interaction is a figment of his imagination, and that it's maybe his brain coping with that, with the things that he did during the war. But that didn't pan out either. And I'm glad that it didn't, because what we got was pretty solid in terms of just an overarching theme for the entire episode, or the overarching theme of Civil War aftermath, I guess. So, Lavinia comments on how worn and tired the passersby look, and, in general, like, when watching this a second and third and fourth time and everything, it seems pretty obvious, like, how it's going to go. But it's interesting because I'll be injecting my different theories throughout this review. So it's just interesting to see how, maybe it's a testament to Serling's writing, that when you first watch this episode, your mind is kind of working overtime, or at least mine was, to try to figure out like what's going to happen, or what the kind of big thing is, what the big hook of the episode is. And I was completely wrong. And in revisiting this episode, you see how tight that story is, and how tight the actual narrative is leading up to the end scene and the revelation that they're all dead, essentially. And it's really tight writing. And it's something that obviously 3 seasons into the show, we come to expect out of Serling. And it's just no different here and everything. So as she's commenting on the demeanor of the Confederate soldiers, or the soldiers walking along the road, she asks the sergeant to play the guitar loud enough to drown out the sound of the footsteps. And there's something here that the sergeant says, "Come on, ma'am, you don't want," and then she cuts him off and kind of reasserts herself, says like, "Yes, please play," and everything. And there's something about that delivery that he does of, "Come on, ma'am, you don't want that." It's just something that he just seems just genuinely concerned for her mental well-being in that moment. Maybe I'm reading into it, or maybe I'm putting something in there that's not, but he just seems very he seems very reluctant to let her not see what's going on in her front lawn and along the road in front of her house. So at this point, we get the opening narration, which I will play now as it is cut through. It's cut into two separate parts.
This road is the afterwards of the Civil War. It began at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, and ended at a place called Appomattox. It's littered with the residue of broken battles and shattered dreams. In just a moment, you will enter a strange province that knows neither north nor south, a place we call the Twilight Zone.
Okay, so my immediate theory after this point in the episode was maybe he's the ghost of her husband. And in reading my notes when I'm going through the episode again to kind of fine-tune my notes when I'm making notes for the podcast, I had to stop here and laugh at myself because I did not think that theory through all that well. Like, of course he's not the ghost of her husband, because she would recognize him to be her husband. Like, that's a moronic theory that I had. So that didn't really pan out there. So, as they're kind of lounging around or sitting around there, she sees a man that she recognizes, this man named Charlie Constable, which also I think that's just a really cool name, Charlie Constable. But this interaction that she has with him is incredibly disturbing and haunting. She runs up to him and says like, oh, it's Charlie. We heard that you were shot in the head in Gettysburg. And he wasn't, or he was, but he wasn't. Anyway, when she goes up to him, he just has this really blank expression on his face. He's like in a trance, and he doesn't even acknowledge her. And throughout most of this interaction, he is just staring intently at the road, like ahead of the road. And he's staring with this kind of look of glee on his face. I can't really do justice to the description of the facial expression of Charlie Constable in this scene, because it's not really a look of glee. It's just this like glazed over look of awe and wonder at what's ahead of him, essentially. And it is an incredibly haunting performance. And it's not until I think she puts her hand on his face that he turns and actually acknowledges her and sees her. And at this point, like, it's pretty clear the passersby are ghosts. Like, it's pretty obvious at this point that that's what's going on, essentially. And it's just such a haunting prospect, given the setting of the episode, the time frame of the episode, essentially. And it's really haunting. And something that the actor who plays Charlie does is he takes off his like bedroll and his pack, and while he's doing that, he doesn't break eye contact with the road. Not immediately, at least, like I said. And like I said, he has that wistful glow of empty happiness on his face. And it's interesting because I found it to be particularly disturbing, like kind of haunting and almost to the level of being scary, even though I think that's counterintuitive to what the actual episode is trying to showcase for that, because it's not necessarily a haunting thing. It is a haunting thing, but it's not like a terror thing, because it's people that have passed on are moving on to the next stage of their existence and everything. And it's supposed to be, I guess, kind of an optimistic viewpoint, I think. So anyway, as Charlie leaves the scene, Lavinia notices that there's blood on his cap that she has in her hand. And so this is where it lays it pretty thick that, yes, they are ghosts. They are the casualties of the Civil War. And but even the kind of obviousness of that, or the seeming confirmation of that this early in the episode, does not detract from the sentiment of what's to come and everything. It's like I said before, it is a very, very tight script and very just beautifully told story. And there's a certain poetry to it that I'll talk about here in a bit that is just so evocative of a certain sentiment of pain and sorrow and of the time. And so at this point, the sergeant, we get kind of a scene with the sergeant talking about his dad and his childhood. And I don't know. This scene kind of felt a little bit like padding, just a little bit. He's sharing a somewhat unhappy memory, but he does it with this kind of laughing glee that he has, like this general warmth that he says in this delivery of telling or talking about how his father saw him as soft and wanted him to toughen up and everything, and wanted him to be a man and all that. And he's saying this, but he's saying it like it's a fond memory, and it's a weird, like, anachronistic thing for him to do in this scene. But it also doesn't really seem to inform that much in terms of really anything in the episode for me. Maybe it's to make it more tragic that he's dead, but I don't know. Or maybe it's just to show the how widespread the war was, how it's just people that probably wouldn't have been in war or enlisted for a cause were in it. I don't know. Maybe I'm reaching there, but this just felt kind of like a little, I don't know. It felt a little unimportant in the grand scheme of things. So as he's talking, as he starts singing and everything, he kind of takes on this kind of tone of like he's serenading her a little bit, and that's kind of doubled down a little bit, or it's maybe not confirmed, but it's interesting because she says that Judd, her husband, used to sing that same song that he sings, which the song I think is "Black is the Color of My True Love's Hair," and that song was in the public domain from the trivia that I read, so that's why it was used in the episode. But anyway, I've got to admit something embarrassing, because in my notes for my first viewing, my notes doubled down on like my bonehead theory. I put in my notes, he's totally her husband's ghost. And I think the fact that he was singing "Black is the Color of My True Love's Hair," just like the lyrics of that made me think that maybe he was the ghost of her husband. But again, it would have made no sense. Like, I don't know why I was so married to that theory on that first viewing. So now it's Lavinia's turn to kind of reminisce about her life before the war. And that's something that I find really interesting about the structure of this episode, or of the script of this episode, is that there's like this back and forth between Lavinia and the sergeant. And I'll talk more about that when we get to the scene with the silhouetted soldier. But like, we just had a scene with the sergeant talking about his past, and now we have a scene of Lavinia reminiscing about how beautiful and peaceful her home was before the war. And this also, like she's saying all of these just beautiful, she's recounting all this beautiful imagery of the land that she occupied before the war. And then she breaks out and says, "Then the Yankees came, blue locusts had to eat away the trees, the land, and everything on it." And at this point, I'm just realizing that this episode lives in a state of such despair and pain, and that the poetry of that despair really is really at its core. It's what makes this episode for me. It's what makes this episode elevate past just kind of a middle of the road, no pun intended, episode of the Twilight Zone into maybe not upper tier, but it does make it stand out of the pack of the kind of average episodes that I've seen. And again, just the poetry of that despair is written so beautifully. Like her describing the Union soldiers as blue locusts eating away the trees and the land and everything is just so hauntingly beautiful. And it's also setting up her vengeful state of mind toward the Union Army. So she goes on to say that she blames the Union Army for what's happened to her land, the trees, and everything that was, including my husband's life. And that's when we realize that she plans on killing a Union soldier. And the sergeant asks, "Well, why don't you just leave?" And she says, "This is all that I have." And that's such a painful sentiment in an already painful soliloquy, if you will, that this is literally like the land that she occupies and the home that she has that's already been ravaged by war is all that she has in the world. And because her husband is gone and everything, it's literally all that she has in the world. And that's just, it's heartbreaking, and it's really beautifully subtle in its depiction in this episode. So she starts to kind of ponder, and she asks what the sergeant thinks happened to the Yankee who killed her husband. And at this point, again, a little bit embarrassing, because at this point in my first viewing, I still could not understand if he was a Union soldier or a Confederate soldier. And I started to think, okay, well, maybe he's not the ghost of her husband. Maybe he's the man who killed her husband. And I was into that. I was probably into that more than the bonehead theory of him being the ghost of her husband. But either way, it didn't pan out, and I do like the way that the episode ends up, as I'll get to in a bit. But he does respond to her and say, if you let that kind of poison sit on your mind, you'll die from it. And first of all, I love that as foreshadowing, obviously, to the revelation that she's dead. But I also love that just as a general sentiment of mental health and of taking control of your own negative feelings and everything. It's just a very succinct and beautiful line. If you let that kind of poison sit on your mind, you'll die from it. It's an interesting caution. So, like I said, she's thinking about killing Yankees, and she says that at some point a Yankee soldier is going to come onto her property and I'm going to kill him. And she says he can consider this the last shot of the Civil War, which I think is just a really powerful statement. And I love the way that it's kind of reversed or reworked with Abe Lincoln's scene at the end of the episode. And I also love the sergeant's response to this. He is offended by that, and he goes into this whole like monologue about how he's essentially saying that he's sick of war and sick of death, and he's just saying like exactly how I've got to say he's saying what I would imagine Serling must have felt after he was in the war, like working through his post-traumatic stress disorder and everything. Like the words that the sergeant says and what he says about he's sick of the killing and sick of the war and everything, it rings so true and so powerfully in the episode that I've got to say that I'm sure that Serling worked from his own position into that script, I guess. And so now we get the silhouetted man on horseback. And like I said, this episode is structured in such a way that both Lavinia and the sergeant have similar experiences, but independent of each other. So, like I said, the sergeant tells the story about his father, his past, and then Lavinia talks about her past before the war and her home and everything, and all of the beauty of the home. And so she had an encounter with Charlie Constable, and now it's the sergeant's turn to have an encounter with one of the passersby. So the silhouetted man arrives on horseback. He stops in front of the house, and he's completely silhouetted, which I think is just a beautiful choice, which I'll talk about here in a second. So at this point, I kind of realized, or I started thinking that the entire kind of idea of this episode and the structure of this episode, it could really be made into what I think would be a really good stage production for live theater. I think it could be beautifully done on stage. So the silhouetted man is a Union soldier, and as the sergeant approaches him and starts talking to him, we see in the background Lavinia running, like hurriedly running into the house. And it's clear that she's going into the house to get the gun that she referenced. And again, I just want to reiterate that I really love the structure of this, because not only are they having a one-on-one scene, both the sergeant and Lavinia have a one-on-one scene with a passerby, both different but also similar. It's the fact that not only are they having that interaction independent of each other, but this is the moment where each of them is kind of coming to the realization, maybe not consciously for Lavinia, but definitely for the sergeant, starting to realize that the passersby are all dead and what the implications of that mean for them existing there. So the sergeant is talking to the lieutenant, the Union lieutenant, and he mentions, like, he says, like, oh, I remember you. You were the lieutenant. You and your Yankees saved me when I was injured. And that is just such an interesting, like, that in general is such an interesting element or wrinkle to put into the episode, because this is the American Civil War, obviously kind of brother fighting brother, North and South and everything. And just the idea of this Confederate soldier remembering this Union lieutenant for saving his life when he's injured on the battlefield is just really kind of powerful storytelling, and says a lot about just the nature of the Civil War in the context of this episode and everything. So after he comes to that realization about the lieutenant, Lavinia comes out with a shotgun trained on him. And first of all, I love the framing of this. Also, just the camera has it positioned to where she's fully in frame and everything, but it's the shotgun is kind of at an angle, so it looks much more intimidating than if it were just filmed kind of not at an angle, just kind of like maybe not straight on, but I don't know, something about the positioning of it really made it feel intimidating and more artistic in the presentation of it. So, and in addition to that, Lavinia is going into this spiel talking about, I don't remember exactly what she said, which is embarrassing, but exactly what she said, but whatever words she used was very poetic and kind of beautifully stated. And at this point, the sergeant, he's trying to reason with her, and then he tries to stop her. He takes the crutch and tries to knock the gun away from her. And I really love this like moment here, because it's really good like physical blocking in the episode, and it's scored by kind of a stinger of score that really just bursts through the tension and everything. And I just really love that, just as a bit of action in the episode. And even though he knocked the gun away from her with the crutch, he kind of stumbles and falls. And while he's falling, she picks up the gun and repositions it and fires at him. And she says, I couldn't have missed you, not at this range. And he just says, it doesn't matter whether you missed or didn't or whatever. And in my notes, stupid, embarrassing note or stupid note, but he's a ghost. So I'm sorry. Anyway, so at this point, okay, I'm going to talk about Lost, the TV show Lost. And if you don't want to be spoiled on Lost, go ahead and just skip ahead 30 seconds or a minute or so, because I'll be spoiling the last season of Lost in a significant way. And it's one of my favorite shows, so I really don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it yet, even though the finale aired like 10 years ago. So I'm kind of talking right now so that you guys can grab your phone or grab your app or whatever and skip ahead and everything, because I would hate to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it. So go ahead and skip ahead 1 minute and avoid the spoiler for Lost that I'm about to drop here on the episode. So this episode of The Twilight Zone gave me such a very, very strong final season of Lost vibe, and I adore it for that, because I adore Lost. Lost is one of my favorite shows of all time, and the final season has the characters in... It's not... people say it's purgatory, and they misinterpret it as meaning that they were dead the whole time. That's not the case. They're just in this way station of a realm where they have to find each other and realize... help each other realize that they are on their way to the afterlife. And then the end of the entire series is them gathering in a church and moving on together. So I don't know if Lost used this episode as a template, at least not consciously or intentionally, but my love of Lost is really what makes this episode go down really smoothly and it makes me feel more affinity for it than I think I would have otherwise. Okay, so spoilers for Lost out of the way. Anyway, so after the gunshot, the sergeant looks up at the lieutenant, and that's when he remembers that the lieutenant, when he met him, was struck by like some kind of explosive device or something, and he was struck and yelled that he was blind, and he was clawing at his eye. Like the kind of pantomime that the sergeant does, and also just the words like clawing at his eye, saying that he's blind, like that is very evocative of just a traumatic moment and everything. Like it is very vivid detail. And then the episode does something that I was very surprised by, because the sergeant brings the lantern up and sees the gore of the lieutenant's eyes and it seems like really gruesome, and you hear like the gasp of Lavinia in the background, and it's just, I mean, it's kind of gory, especially for the time, the era, 1961. I'm surprised that they could get away with that, but I don't know. So anyway, before we end this section of it, or this scene, I do want to mention that the cinematography of having that lieutenant in silhouette as he's talking to the sergeant, or as the sergeant is talking to him, is just stunning cinematography. I thought that was really striking and a really just really beautiful thing that led to that shock of the reveal of the eye injury. And so the lieutenant says, "I wish the best for you, ma'am, and you, sir. This too shall pass. This too shall pass. Wait and see. Wait and see." And that just, that really stuck with me and felt just really kind of haunting in a certain respect. I know I've been using that word a lot throughout this episode, but it is a very haunting effect, and it really made me wonder if the sergeant at this point if he isn't fully aware that he's dead. Maybe that's why the lieutenant stopped for such a long time, to kind of help guide the sergeant into realizing that he's going to need to move on to the next realm of existence and everything. And to kind of back up that kind of claim, I guess, the sergeant in the next scene, it's kind of the next day, it's an act break, the next day, he's leaving, he's packed up and he's leaving. He thanks Lavinia for her hospitality, and he mentions that the passersby stopped coming at night and stopped coming over that night. And he came to a realization, but I also just want to backtrack just a little bit. He refers to Lavinia as Mrs. Godwin. Godwin, just a piece of trivia, the name Godwin is a reference to someone that Serling served with in the war, that he intentionally put into the script as a nod to that man. And apparently the real person, I don't remember the first name of the man that he served with, but that man would apparently joke throughout the war that the South really won the Civil War. So it's kind of funny and cute that Serling gave him that kind of jokey reference in a name on the Twilight Zone. So the sergeant has come to a realization and says that he talks about how the Union and Confederate soldiers are walking down the road together. And he's kind of come to this compulsion and this realization that he has to find out what's at the end of the road. And the sergeant, like I said, he feels compelled toward the end of the road. And I thought that was a really interesting, supernatural and beautiful realization of that kind of common, I see a light at the end of the tunnel kind of near-death experience thing. It's just an interesting kind of extrapolation of that sentiment and everything. And so Lavinia asks him to stay, and he just says no. And she says, well, what are you going to find at the end of the road? A new Confederacy born out of the ashes of the old one and everything? And I think he kind of shrugs her off and everything, but that's when Judd arrives. And this is the timing of this is interesting, I should say, because it's like in retrospect, this episode is about her reluctance to accept that she's died. And Judd arriving at that moment is kind of, I kind of feel like maybe it's the Twilight Zone throwing a Hail Mary. I kind of wonder if the sergeant was supposed to be the person to guide her into the afterlife, or to nudge her into that realization. But I found it interesting that he doesn't really seem to see that as his responsibility or anything. But then the Twilight Zone gives her Judd and then Abraham Lincoln. So I don't know. It's just it's an interesting story in terms of the main character, one of the main characters having to come to a realization of what point of her life she is in, essentially. So anyway, she's happy when Judd arrives, and as they're having their big reunion, the sergeant starts gathering his things, and he's going to leave and everything. And so Judd says to her that it was home, but it isn't any longer. He references that their home isn't their home anymore. And she kind of misconstrues that as being like, well, it's been destroyed by the war. And so she says they can rebuild. And Judd kind of looks past her at the sergeant. And I loved this. I loved this so much because he asks the sergeant if he knows. And the sergeant says he thinks that he does, but he can't be sure. And then he goes about his way. Again, super strong vibes of Lost, and I love it for that. So, I love that they have this, Judd and the sergeant kind of have this shared knowledge that they're not giving it to Lavinia because she needs to come to that realization herself. And it's really interesting. And the sergeant, as he's leaving, says, ma'am, there's no doubt I'll be seeing you at the end of that road. And I found that just really compelling because he sees what's happening. He knows what is happening, what the truth of the passersby is, and he knows what's to come. He knows they're all dead. But he also, like I said, he knows that it's not his responsibility to open her eyes to the truth. She needs to come to that realization and that discovery for herself. And I thought that was just really, really compelling writing from Serling. So, then, as the sergeant leaves, she asks Judd what's happened, like what's going on. And he says, again, beautiful, heartfelt, poetic words. He says, your life is kind of like a song. You play it right to the end, and when the notes are finished, they die out into silence. And just beautiful. It's so beautiful. It kind of solidifies that this episode is all about moving on to an afterlife, essentially. And the Twilight Zone has done that in the past. Like, was it A Nice Place to Visit with the kind of criminal guy who goes into goes into hell? Yeah, I don't know. But anyway, I think it was A Nice Place to Visit. I'm almost positive that was the title, so hopefully I'm not wrong. But this has such an emotional context to it, though. This depiction of the afterlife is so emotionally heavy and filled with this almost metaphysical, spiritual kind of thing. And like, I'm not a religious person or anything like that. I don't know what I think or I don't know what I think about the afterlife. Like, I don't have like a theory about what happens when we die, but this depiction, the depiction of this in this episode is just so, there's a warmth to the haunting nature of it that I can't really deny. And I think that it's just really well orchestrated and well depicted in this episode. So, we've got confirmation. Judd is dead, and so is Lavinia. And he kind of confirms to her. He says that you died of the fever, and she even still, she won't accept it. And he says that he'll see her at the end of the road, kind of echoing what the sergeant said. And again, just super powerful because this is just leaving it to her own self-discovery. And I love this episode for that because, like, what in any kind of ethereal or ethereal, I'm not sure. But anyway, any metaphysical like depiction of the afterlife and everything, it's a highly, highly intensely personal experience. Like, everyone does it. Everyone dies, except for Walter Jameson eventually. But but everyone dies, and just like having that communal thing with the people walking on the road, but also having that just intensely personal self-discovery of the character, having to come to terms with it on her own, and kind of like reaching that conclusion on her own to an extent is really kind of palpably beautiful. So we're kind of winding down, and like in my notes I have, oh shit, Abe Lincoln, because Honest Abe shows up walking down the road, and I love this performance. It feels so genuinely warm. as a depiction of Abe Lincoln. So he says, "You're staying behind, my dear?" And she says that she's afraid. And I thought there was so much power behind this line that Lincoln says. He says, "Of course you are. I am too." And it's so powerful and poignant. This person who 100 years after the Civil War, we see as this almost mythical figure. Like it's like Michael Scott in The Office says, Abe Lincoln said, "If you're a racist, I will attack you with the North," or whatever. But no, he was the leader of the country during the most tumultuous experience of the country's young history at that point. And to have him be this, have this mythical, almost mythical, legendary person of history just admit that he's scared too of dying and everything and going into the afterlife is just there's so much power and relatability and just beautiful poetry to that. And then he goes on to quote Shakespeare from, I think it was Julius Caesar, I'm not sure. But then he says that he's the last casualty of the Civil War, which beautiful writing from Serling, just absolutely beautiful, because it's reworking the line that Lavinia said early in the episode, saying that the Union soldier that she is going to kill is going to be as a vengeful thing. Not even the person who killed her husband, just any Union soldier. It's going to be the last shot of the Civil War. And to have Lincoln kind of recontextualize that sentiment as him just saying that he's the last casualty of the Civil War, that now it's giving this sense of finality, the same way that Lavinia's kind of threat does, but in a more kind of emotionally resonant way. Just saying that I'm the last casualty of the Civil War, that's concluding the Civil War, and that's when, Reconstruction and rebuilding and everything can actually begin. And then he says, "And I'm the last man on this road." And this is signaling to Lavinia that, she needs to run along to the end of the road, into the afterlife and everything, because he is the caboose. He's bringing up the rear. And I don't know, I just thought it was really beautiful and poignant, and it resonates with her because she runs after Judd, and I just thought that was a really beautiful and poignant ending. And I'm going to go ahead and play the closing narration from Rod Serling.
Incident on a dirt road during the month of April, the year 1865. As we've already pointed out, it's a road that won't be found on a map, but it's one of many that lead in and out of the Twilight Zone.
And I think that's a really beautiful and poignant and succinct, maybe not poignant, but really beautiful and succinct closing narration from Serling. Because we don't need much. There's enough emotional weight in the actual episode to not have it be kind of restated in kind of a more verbose closing narration. So I appreciate it for that. So I've mentioned some trivia and everything throughout the episode. One thing that I didn't mention is that elements of this episode were remade in an episode of the 2002 revival of The Twilight Zone. The title of that episode was Homecoming. And in that episode, a soldier returns from Iraq to repair his relationship with his son. The soldier is played by Gil Bellows. And the son is played by Penn Badgley, who I believe is on that show You on Netflix. And Gil Bellows, of course, was in Shawshank Redemption, and also you might also like from the 2019 Twilight Zone season, the series finale of the CBS All Access Twilight Zone. That's really all the trivia that I have. Overall, honestly, I was prepared, going into this review, I was prepared to just kind of say, like I said earlier in this episode, that this was a middle of the road Twilight Zone episode. And I think in talking it out and talking out the themes and the kind of heaviness of the episode and the resonance of it as well, like I said, it has really elevated this episode for me and really makes it stand out from the pack as a pretty strong episode. Like I said, it's not going to rank as high as The Obsolete Man or The Monsters Joe on Maple Street or The Shelter or The Last Flight for that matter. God, I love The Last Flight, but but it's still a very compelling and very poignant episode that has just a lot of heart to it, and is just a really beautiful episode in its own right, with a minimal set, and but taking that minimalistic set and just cranking it up to the max in terms of set design, it just really makes it become a more fully rounded episode, really on all fronts. So yeah. All right, so now I'm going to close out this episode with a review of Science Fiction Theater, Season 1, Episode 14, The Strange Doctor Lorenz. So, The Strange Doctor Lorenz originally aired on July 9th, 1955, and the plot summary, courtesy of IMDb, is a physician who is losing the use of his hands due to X-ray radiation seeks out a mysterious beekeeper who is apparently able to cure the most severe burns. This episode stars Edmund Gwen as Dr. Lorenz, Donald Curtis as Dr. Fred Garner, and Christine Miller as Helen Tuttle. Also Charles Wagenheim as Everett, and Hank Patterson as George. So like how the show is structured and everything, it starts with a pre-show introduction by host Truman Bradley, and he opens it with a pretty big statement. He says, "Since the dawn of time, man has been at odds with nature." And he does some demonstrations. He talks about how lightning was the first, the nature's way of teaching us about electricity, and how birds were nature's way of teaching us about aerodynamics, and how bats taught us about sonar and everything. And so he's kind of using this as a demonstration to lead into how mankind learns from nature, and how it's at odds with nature and learns from nature and everything. So the episode proper, it's pretty good. I'm noticing, so I'm 14 episodes into Science Fiction Theater, and of course I'm not going to spoil this episode outright. It should be available to stream somewhere online, not on any streaming service, but I've been putting links to these episodes in the show notes. At like Daily Motion has them, so I don't know, just Google the episodes and you should be able to find them, hopefully. But the episode proper is pretty solid, but what I'm noticing as I'm kind of moving through is that there's kind of a lot of repetition, and the show isn't really interested in subtlety or in leaving things up to the imagination of the audience. So when we have like the doctor kind of gauging how bad his hands are in terms of radiation and everything, the dialogue is essentially like, "Oh, I have X-ray radiation and everything, and I'm going to lose the use of my hands and everything." It's just spelling out the circumstances for the audience, and it's I don't know, it kind of gets a little grating. Also, it's a low budget show, and I'm noticing like they're using the same sets and everything for labs and everything, which is fine, but it kind of makes me laugh a little bit. So the actual episode, it's weird because it's comes right after 100 Years Young, and it has kind of that same formula throughout it. Basically, this episode is about the Dr. Lorenz, the strange Dr. Lorenz, who's this eccentric beekeeper, doctor, scientist guy who has like the ability to heal things that should otherwise be unhealable. And the core of the episode is basically saying that it's having power to it's wrestling with the implications of using your power for the greater good of humanity and everything, like using this thing that you have discovered and this thing that you have refined for the greater good of humanity without properly testing it and everything. So it's kind of a similar vibe from 100 Years Young, because a lot of that story was about how this serum exists to keep you alive for hundreds of years and everything, but you have to keep using it every 6 months or it'll wear off or whatever. It's the same kind of thing here in this episode. It's like these, the secret to the formula to heal and everything needs to be re-administered and everything. It's just kind of a kind of copy and paste kind of thing with, as the last episode, which is unfortunate, but I'm not going to fault it too much because it was still pretty entertaining and everything. And kind of on the bigger scale, I really like the vibe of this show. Like, again, it's taking these science fiction storylines and creating in them this grounded, realistic, hard sci-fi approach to it. And they're introducing this element that is like almost has to be supernatural in content. Like in this case, they find there's this young boy who had 3rd-degree burns over a third of his body, and they were healed within 3 hours from this doctor in a swamp. And that is a fantastical idea. That is an out of this world supernatural has to be kind of thing. And then what the show does is it goes into overdrive to create this realistic scenario as an answer to what that means or what caused him to be healed and everything. And it passes the smell test. Like, it's not something that I was nitpicking or I was disengaged by or anything. It's like, oh yeah, okay. I mean, I buy that. I buy this scenario that the show is delivering to me, and especially with Truman Bradley's opening segment where he talks of, like, he's priming us for that, saying that, like, human beings learn from nature, and who knows what nature is going to provide for us now. And so the actual answer to healing the characters in this episode comes from nature in a pretty interesting way. So yeah, and I don't know what else I want to say without spoiling it, but I will say that it involves bees, and it involves the use of the word royal jelly, which this is completely superfluous to the actual review and everything, and it's disconnected from it, but I cannot hear the words royal jelly without thinking of the song from Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox story, that it's called Royal Jelly. I don't have a clip or anything, but it's basically John C. Reilly's character, Dewey Cox, doing this, I almost said Bob Hope, but that's not right, Bob Dylan style of kind of song, and the lyrics are kind of vulgar, and the way it incorporates the word royal jelly just made me laugh when I heard it in the context of this episode. So it's very juvenile, very vulgar, but check it out. It's on YouTube. It's silly and funny. So 14 episodes into Science Fiction Theater, we are getting closer and closer to whatever episode it was that aired the night of the Enchantment Under the Sea dance in Back to the Future. I have been keeping tabs on that. This episode aired in July of 1955. That episode will have aired in November of 1955, given the timing of Back to the Future and everything in the setting. So we'll keep our ear to the ground in that respect for that. So yeah. So I don't really have anything else to say about this episode of Science Fiction Theater, except that Edmund Gwenn, who plays Dr. Lorenz, he has kind of this this way of carrying himself that kind of reminded me a little bit of Alfred Hitchcock, in a way. I don't know. And then also on that same kind of note, Donald Curtis, who played Dr. Garner, looks like he's a dead ringer for like a young Sean Connery, like Dr. No, early Bond movie era Sean Connery. And that was kind of, I don't know, that was not distracting, but it caught my eye a little bit. So yeah, so overall, pretty good episode of Science Fiction Theater. I'm really hoping that the next one breaks from the formula that has been used in the last 2 episodes at least. So I'm hoping for a little bit more variety, but I'm still enjoying it, and I'm glad that I'm doing these bonus reviews for that. And yeah, so that'll do it for this episode of Anthology. Next week, I'm going to be taking a break from science fiction theater, because next week I'm reviewing Twilight Zone Season 3, Episode 5, A Game of Pool, which has a remake from the 1985 Twilight Zone remake. So A Game of Pool and A Game of Pool are going to be my reviews for next week. And that'll do it for this episode of Anthology. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I really hope you guys, I hope that the sound quality is okay as I work through it. Thank you for your patience as I work through the new equipment. And I'll see you guys next time. Thank you so much for listening, and have a good one. And now, here's a short clip from our Patreon-exclusive RSS feed. To hear the full clip and more exclusive Patreon content, go to patreon.com/obsessiveviewer and become a patron at the minimum rate of $1 per month. Thank you and enjoy. Have you still not seen Little Guys?
I've seen it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you love it?
Yeah, it's very cute. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I would have loved it as a kid.
Yeah.
I can tell you that. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
I was worried that if you weren't a fan of it, then I would turn into a real icebox toward you over it.
Totally.
Because the character's name is
right.
Icebox.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that movie.
Anthology is edited and produced by Matt Hurt and presented by ObsessiveViewer.com. For a full archive of our episodes, go to anthologypod.com/archive. You can also like the Facebook page at facebook.com/anthologypod and follow the show on Twitter at OVAnthologyPod. If you enjoy the show, please take a couple minutes to leave us a rating and a quick review on Apple Podcasts. This is the easiest way to support what we do, and all it costs is a little bit of your time. If you'd like to donate to the podcast, you can make a PayPal donation at anthologypod.com/donate or support us on Patreon for recurring donations and access to commentary tracks and B-roll audio recorded exclusively for patrons at patreon.com/obsessiveviewer. Every donation goes toward paying the fees to keep the podcast running and is greatly appreciated. Official Anthology merch, including shirts, mugs, phone cases, and more, can be found in the Obsessive Viewer's TeePublic store. You can find a link to the store in the show notes of this episode and at anthologypod.com/donate. Or you can simply search for Obsessive Viewer at tpublic.com. For information about the Obsessive Viewer's annual live event showcasing short horror films from local filmmakers, check out shocktoberinirvington.com. And for an archive of all our events, as well as news about potential future events, head over to obsessiveviewer.com/live. For more podcast content, you can find our flagship movie and TV review and discussion show, The Obsessive Viewer Podcast, at obsessiveviewer.com, and on Twitter at obsessiveviewer. You can also find Tower Junkies, a podcast where Matt and co-host Tiny share their love of all things Stephen King and his magnum opus, The Dark Tower series, over at towerjunkiespod.com and at towerjunkiespod on Twitter. And finally, check out The Secular Perspective, Tiny's side project podcast, which tackles current events and life's big questions from the perspective of secular hosts Chad and Amanda at thesecularperspective.com. Bumper music for this podcast comes courtesy of As Good As It Gets, which can be found at facebook.com/asgoodasitgetsband. You can also find As Good As It Gets music on Spotify, Google Play, and iTunes. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Kitty!